Can you hear me? Perfect. These two papers are extremely well matched. Maybe I'll save some time on motivation and stuff, and I'll try to the extent possible to kind of link some of our conclusions to the last one. I think they're quite consistent, actually. We're finding a very similar story. So this work is co-authored with Michael Bates, Andrew Johnston, and Isaac Sorkin. The first slide is going to look really familiar if you backtrack about 40 minutes. So teachers, we estimate, or a lot of people have estimated that they matter a lot for student outcomes and that some teachers are much better than others. So the assignment of teachers to schools could be quite consequential for both equity and efficiency. But as we just saw in the last presentation, it's also going to be true in our context. Within a school district, salaries are uniform. So for a given teacher, he or she is not paid more depending on her assignment. And this can lead to inequity based on the motivation you just heard. Also, of course, inefficiency. If some teachers are particularly effective with certain student types, if they're not compensated financially for that, then they may not end up teaching those students. Okay, so there are reasons to think that the wage uniformity might be problematic. And so in this paper, we're going to try to quantify that. How equitable and efficient is the current allocation of teachers to schools? And then we'll try to explain why that is. And we'll see how much time I have, but I'll comment at the end a little bit on what policies might improve on the allocation. So we start with, we're going to look at a large school district in North Carolina and elementary schools. And unlike the previous presentation, we estimate that the current allocation is actually remarkably equitable. So the quality of teachers across disadvantaged and advantaged students is quite similar. This is potentially quite surprising based on the prior paper, but also just like the prior paper, we find a lot of signs that teachers do want to teach advantaged students. So it's not that teachers necessarily have really different preferences in this context. They still seem to want to go to those schools, but we're getting an equitable allocation. On the efficiency side, though, our kind of casual logic about what salary uniformity might imply does seem to hold. We identify, or we estimate that there are pretty large potential gains in terms of total student learning if we were to reassign kids in a district. Here, the magnitudes I'm going to talk about are student standard deviations. So 5% of a student standard deviation on average. So once we estimate that the current allocation is quite equitable, we want to understand why that is. And so we posit a few potential explanations that we'll quantify in the rest of the paper. The first is perhaps there's something about market clearing. There's timing or equilibrium selection that ends up in a place that's favorable to disadvantaged students. Second, it could be that, sure, we know these facts about average teacher preferences, but maybe the marginal teacher looks pretty different from the average teacher. And so the joint distribution of teacher preferences and their quality, which I'm going to call VA for value added, is complicated and leads to an equitable distribution. Third, the schools that have excess labor supply, like lots of teachers want to teach there, they may not exploit this supply and hire the best teachers. This could be principals not screening well or preferring to hire based on other factors. And then fourth, there could be match effects. Maybe a lot of teachers seek to end up at the schools with advantaged students, but once those schools take a set of teachers, the leftover teachers are actually quite effective with the remaining students. Okay, so we actually came into this project with a pretty diffuse prior over which of these four explanations is playing a big role. Based on the last presentation, you actually might be able to start to guess which one it is. So in order to estimate or quantify these different channels, we're going to estimate a model, an equilibrium model, that uses data on a teacher transfer system linked to test score data. On the student output side, we're going to estimate a model of teacher value added that includes comparative advantage. So some teachers may be more effective with certain student types. And we're going to estimate this using teacher-student data, where we link teachers to students based on classroom assignment. Then on the labor market side, we're going to estimate how the market clears and preferences of both sides of the market with what we think are relatively weak assumptions compared to the literature. From this, we'll conclude that the reason the initial allocation or the current allocation is equitable is that principals are not hiring the teachers who are best. And so actually what we just saw in the previous paper, where we saw that contract teachers, for which principals couldn't choose which one they wanted, it was a serial dictatorship, we got one kind of relationship between teacher characteristics and student characteristics. But then for the experienced teachers, the permanent teachers, where it wasn't a serial dictatorship, we got a different relationship. That's very consistent here. Here, principals don't need to take the best teachers, and it doesn't look like they are. And that's producing the equitable allocation. On the efficiency side, principals not taking the best teachers actually helps a little bit for efficiency too, but it's not the primary driver. The reason we are lacking efficiency is the uniform salary. Okay, so I'm going to get into a very simple assignment model, and then I'll tell you about our data. Then we'll get into a model of student achievement. I'll briefly talk about how applications and vacancies work in this setting before I estimate teacher and principal preferences and then put them together in equilibrium. And if we have time, I'll talk about bonuses. So really similar structure to what you just saw. Okay, so I'll give you just some kind of generic details about our setting that will motivate why we specify our simple model. So in our labor market, every year, there's a period during spring through summer in which a market clears on a rolling basis. So vacancies for teaching at a given school will pop up, and then people will apply, and then they might fill at any moment. It's decentralized. Teachers apply through a centralized platform, but all decisions are decentralized. So principals can take the applications they receive, decide who to give an interview to, and who to make an offer to. And wages do not vary with assignment. We're going to model how teacher school assignments are formed, as well as the value from each assignment. In our model, there are two types of agents. They're the teachers who have preferences and then will be teaching at the schools. And then there are school principals who are simply hiring. We'll consider mostly the output measure of students' test scores, though I might show you at times how teachers feel about different allocations. And then we're going to assume pairwise stability for all equilibrium allocations. Okay, so the building blocks of this model are straightforward. Teachers are indexed by J, schools by K. If teacher J winds up teaching at school K, she derives a non-wage utility, and then there's a wage component. On the principal side, if a principal at school K hires teacher J, the value to that has a non-wage component less the wage. We're not going to necessarily commit to like a utility interpretation to describe why principals are acting in a certain way. They're just going to make decisions about hiring. But if you want to think of it in a utility framework, that's fine. And then from each match of teacher J to school K, we're going to have an associated student output, which I'll label VA for value added, like how much a teacher increases a student's test scores relative to some benchmark. Okay, so we're going to model the market as coming from a decentralized equilibrium where schools and teachers meet and match. Schools can match with teachers who are in the market at the same time. So if we're in May and I'm a teacher and I'm looking for positions, then I can be considered at the vacancies that are also open in May. But for the ones that already cleared in April, I'm not eligible for those. So there's a timing component here. We may not actually have the teachers who are good fits for certain schools in the market at the same time. And then we're going to assume pairwise stability such that no teacher and school pair not already matched would prefer to deviate and match. And then we're going to characterize the set of potential allocations using variations on the deferred acceptance algorithm. To be clear, in this setting, they don't actually use DA. We're going to use DA to balance kind of what could happen given our assumptions. Okay, so let's get back to some of the potential explanations for the equity that we see in the current allocation. I mentioned two in market clearing. The first could be equilibrium selection. You know, we might get a multiplicity of equilibria, and perhaps there's something institutional that's leading to choosing the equilibrium that's most favorable for disadvantaged students. So we will assess equilibrium multiplicity in our analysis. Second, it could be this timing consideration. Perhaps lots of the best teachers would love to go to the advantaged schools, but then they're not in the market at the same time. So we're going to vary that within our model and counterfactual analysis. Third, teachers' preferences, marginal might not equal average. And so we're going to estimate teachers' preferences and relate these to teacher quality. Fourth, principals may select teachers to hire based on complicated things that are not actually their value added. So we will estimate the principal's preferences and relate that to the teacher's value added. And then finally, in terms of match effects, we're going to look at the structure of value added as we estimate it. These things, of course, all matter for efficiency as well, not just equity. And in the paper, we draw out efficiency much more than I am in the talk today. Okay, so I think also a useful benchmark is what would the district prefer? What's their first best problem? So we conceptualize this as the district choosing among one-to-one assignments of teachers to schools. You could, of course, have multiple positions at a school, but for the moment, we're thinking of one position per school. The district cares about some weighted average of student output, student achievement, and teacher utility, although you could think that the district just cares about student output. And so we'll show you at least what happens when we trace the weight, or when we implement different weights on students to show you just the trade-offs in the system between how much student learning there is and how much teachers like different allocations. And then we can also explore equity objectives by varying kind of welfare weights across students, so valuing output at certain students more than others. Okay, so really simple assignment model. The paper is really about trying to quantify these things. And so we're going to bring what we think is pretty cool data to estimate these things. The most novel part is, again, pretty similar to what you just saw, but it's all of the application and vacancy data from the teacher labor market. So this is a large urban school district in North Carolina. We have the data for almost a decade. And so we see teachers pop on the website, and then we see them apply to a bunch of positions. So any position you want to be considered at, just like the economics job market, you have to apply to. Then on the other side of the market, the principal receives these applications. We know which ones the principal receives. And then we see on the principal side several actions. We know who they interview, we know who they hire, but we think this is really neat. We also see them rate applications. This is kind of an internal note-taking system, so there's no consequence to ratings, direct consequences. But these ratings are kind of nice for us because we won't have to assume that principals are truth-telling in terms of their interviews or their hires. So we're going to really estimate preferences, principal preferences, using the ratings, which we think are non-strategic. We also know the timing of these events, so we're going to construct like individualized choice sets based on which positions are active at the same time as the teachers. So importantly, like the previous paper, but unlike a lot of the literature, we're going to be estimating preferences with data from actions on both sides of the market and not just inferring them from data only on the equilibrium outcomes. Okay, so then we link this data to somewhat more standard data in education research, which is student level data on students' test scores following students over time. We have this for the whole state of North Carolina. And then a similar data for teachers, a panel of teacher data following them across positions over time. We have teachers and students at the classroom level, so we can construct really fine measures of teacher quality based on classroom assignments. And teachers we also have for the whole state, not just this district. So a lot of these teachers that we'll see will be from different districts looking to transfer in. Okay, I focused the model for this presentation a little bit more on the back half of the paper, but the quantification of like how much student learning there is in any given allocation is going to come from a student achievement model, which we build on largely from the economics of education literature. So I've saved some details here, but if you want, I'm happy to click through so you see the underlying estimating equation more directly. We're going to allow teachers to be different from each other. Some teachers might be more or less effective, and a given teacher might be differentially effective across students who are economically disadvantaged and economically advantaged. We're going to define this according to eligibility for free or reduced price school lunch. Okay, so teachers have a two-dimensional type. For those of you in the education literature, we're going to follow Chetty, Friedman, and Rockoff in that we're going to allow a teacher's type to drift a little bit over time. So a teacher might get better or worse over time. And a teacher's effectiveness with one student type might be pretty correlated with their effectiveness with another student type. We're going to estimate teachers' effectiveness with each student type using prior data only. Now, so I see a teacher in 2016, I'm trying to predict how effective they'll be in the next year. In our data, I do see them in later years, so I could potentially construct a better forecast of their true type. But we're trying to restrict our the forecast we use in our model to what is the data that would be available at the time the allocation decision was made. So from this model, we're going to get a few estimates that we're going to put together to predict a teacher's output at any given school. So the model will deliver a teacher's predicted effectiveness, mu hat, with student type 0, which would be economically advantaged students, and then her effectiveness with student type 1, economically disadvantaged students. And her total output from an assignment will be the weighted sum of these two parts, where the weights are the number of students of each type. And then we add on an experience gradient, because in teaching you often see an output with experience. Okay, so here, in terms of efficiency, there are two margins in which we can get better total output. The first is better sorting on comparative advantage. And then the second is putting the best teachers in the biggest classrooms. And in the paper, I won't talk about it so much today, but in the paper, we tell you how much is driven by each of these margins.
Right? Yep. So the production function is going to be linear, right? It's not going to be because it returns to scale the number of students.
It's going to be linear. So it's not going to, right. So you might be worried about class size effects.
Yeah.
Sorry. Sorry. Oh, that didn't work. Sorry. Class size effects can be nonlinear. We're going to not change the class size distribution as in the data. So we're going to have essentially class size fixed effects. Teachers' quality will be the conditional, like come from a model where those class size fixed effects were in there. The key restriction that we have is that suppose we see a really good teacher in a small class. And then we're going to predict what would happen if we move this really good teacher to a big class. We won't assume that that teacher's total output will remain the same scaled by the number of students. It could decrease because they're class size effects. But we're going to assume the curvature, the extent to which it decreases, doesn't interact with the teacher's type. And we do validation, we look within our data. In sample, this seems to hold, but yeah.
The second question is just out of ignorance. In the counterfactual, you're going to rematch students, right? You're going to stop. We're going to rematch students to teachers.
We're going to keep all the students in the exact same schools we see in their data, in the same classrooms, in the same class sizes, but we're going to move the teachers around.
Yeah. So in the end, the A, the K is going to change in the counterfactual there.
Yes. And it's going to change through this structural equation.
Yeah. Okay.
So I mean, we're going to predict what would happen if we make all these counterfactual assignments. So we need this model to predict these things. And this is kind of how the dimensions in which we predict. Okay, we validate, just like you see in the economics of education literature, we validate these measures. On the x-axis is our prediction based on prior data only. The y-axis is the outcome based on the next year's data. So it's not using the same data in both axes. Our prediction, it looks like we get it right on average. But if you're worried about some biases, they might show up on both axes. If I have better students in one year, I might have unobservably better students in the next year as well. So if we focus on teachers who switch schools in which the students are really different from the one that they came from, teachers who switch across classes of really different sizes, we kind of still get really good predictive value. Okay, so now let's talk about what the current allocation looks like. Actually, I didn't put it in the slides, but Mateo's slide number 5, last presentation, had all of these characteristics of teachers and showed like teachers with more training or kind of more certification are in the richer schools. We see that as well. We see that the advantaged schools have more experienced teachers. They have teachers who are more likely to be certified and so forth. So on teacher observables, we see a pretty strong relationship between student characteristics and teacher characteristics. But when we look at students' test scores, it's a little bit more complicated. So here on the top row, I'm splitting between advantaged students and disadvantaged students. The top row is just their level of test scores in Z-scored. Okay, so advantaged students have much higher test scores than disadvantaged students, right? The gap here is 0.86 of a standard deviation, which is really big. So they're big baseline differences. But if you look at the next row, the change in the students' test scores from one year to the next is quite similar across these two student types. So it's not clear that we're actually delivering these students different quality of instruction. Now, you might want to close these gaps. So I'm not, it depends on your notion of equity, whether this is good, but the gaps are not necessarily increasing. We see this kind of just in the raw data. Now, you might be worried that there are confounders in the raw data. And so when we go to our value added model, which has really good controls, we again see very balanced value added across the two student types. So here you see for advantaged student types, their value added is 0.01. For disadvantaged student types, it's slightly higher. And then actually, I'm going to show you here for teachers who are teaching advantaged students, which is this top row in the bottom panel, they don't have comparative advantage with the students they're teaching. And kind of we don't really see any sorting on comparative advantage. And so the match effects explanation that maybe they're actually like, yeah, there's excess labor supply for certain schools, but doesn't really affect the output in the other schools. That's not really happening here. We don't see the type of sorting that you would need for that. So the match effects explanation for leading to the equitable current allocation, we kind of rule out right here. Also, we specified a model with match effects. It's a more complicated econometric model. If you just go to the standard one used in the literature, you see essential equity. So it's not that our model is really generating that. And a lot of the papers actually in the literature find equitable distributions in the current allocation.
Just a clarification. So the way I should read this is that the gain is 70 and it moves to 77. So the way I should read this is that the gain says that for advanced students, we move from 70 to 77.
Well, so these are z-scores by year. So everything's relative to a given year. And it's also the sample is the whole state. So it's not quite, if you move a whole distribution up for the next year, we'll renormalize. So I don't really have like the numbers.
What I'm trying to get at is, are the 0.07s comparable? That's what I'm trying to get at. So if you're moving, if your z-score is, let's say, negative, it should be easier to move that 0.07 than if you're already on the right table.
Right. So, we're going to, when we take averages in this, we're kind of assuming some linearity in terms of the z, gains at different parts of the distribution of the z-score. One worry might be ceiling effects, which is kids towards the top have not much room to improve. I mean, we see not many, these scores on these tests are not close to the max on the test. I can't rule out ceiling effects, but there's not much bunching anywhere towards the top. You can even look at kids in advantaged schools. Like this is there's your own type and then there's the school type. And so we do have some cross between like kids who are advantaged themselves, but not in the advantaged schools. We kind of see this consistent throughout. So we think like, I'm not sure linearity is quite the right assumption, but we don't see kind of direct, like the obvious deviations like ceiling effects. There's no room to improve your test score. We don't see much evidence of that either.
Sorry, just very quick on the value added thing.
Yep.
There seems to be like very long to interpret this as lack of match, but also the road this value added is poorly predicted by you. So how much of these very tiny levels and differences between advantages and disadvantages pins down the fact that the advantages expect very little on value added.
Advantage. So I put this at the bottom of that. If I were to put teacher experience or other teacher characteristics, they would differ a lot across these columns. The thing is, those things just really poorly predict value added. And so even though there's big differences in observables, they kind of don't wind up mattering for value added. Now, these are low numbers. I mean, they're relative to zero, but sorry, can you explain the second part of your question?
I'm just wondering the extent to which you can interpret the lack of a difference between advantage and disadvantage in terms of value added as lack of match effects. Just because value added seems to be very uncorrelated with the advantage and disadvantage per se.
No, so for a given teacher, her value added with the two student types is highly correlated. Yeah, so it's actually like 0.84. Sorry, well, I should explain. So this top row is teachers who are teaching advantage students. And so for advantage students, this is the value added they actually receive, 0.01. This is a counterfactual value added, which is like if they teach disadvantaged students. And so the difference between the two columns is kind of the comparative advantage. Sorry, I didn't explain that well. Okay, so the current allocation is quite equitable. Let's consider some counterfactual allocations. If we could reassign teachers as we wish, no kind of needing to respect their choice. So the first one we might consider is what's the one that maximizes per student gains? And here the gains are 5% of a standard deviation per student. Doesn't sound too small, too big, but the standard deviation of teacher quality is 0.14. So, you know, that's as if you were giving every student if you're improving their teacher by 1/3 of a standard deviation. So not tiny. Also, if we move to the best allocation, the gains are actually largely for the advantaged students, which kind of interacts with this current equity. A commonly proposed policy in the education literature is to remove the bottom 5% of teachers from the classrooms and replace them with median teachers. That gives you some gains, but actually pretty small relative to the ones we're looking at. Now, this is in part because you're only changing 5% of the teachers, but even if you scale that up, these gains are still going to look pretty good. While we have equity now in terms of delivery of quality, you might want to close some of these initial gaps. The best we estimate you can do is you can deliver disadvantaged students teachers who are 12% of a standard deviation better. But this is kind of pretty counterfactual. We don't think you can necessarily get there unless the district kind of changes its labor market. And so we're going to now get into the labor market side of allocation. I'm going to mostly save time. Actually, we're doing pretty well on time. Let me click through to it. Great, the links don't work. Okay, in this setting, teachers apply to jobs. You actually don't customize your materials per job. You just click a button. Yes, send here, send here, send here. You're not allowed to customize, and you're not allowed to disintermediate the process. You can't contact the principal separately. So we rule out a lot of the types of investments you might want to make your application more desirable. So in terms of actually cost to applying to another job, it's pretty minimal. And so we think the institutions kind of mean that there are reasons to think that you might just apply where you like. They're not kind of these strategic considerations. We do a bunch of further analysis to convince ourselves that teachers are aware of all the jobs that are available when they're on the when they're looking. So that we're going to define teacher-specific choice sets as all the positions that were active when the teacher was active. Finally, we assume we convince ourselves that teachers are applying to jobs non-strategically. They're applying to places that they like. We kind of characterize a bunch of the deviations from this that you might expect, portfolio type strategies, weighting type strategies, and we see nothing consistent with these actions. Okay, so we look at the data, we kind of lead into thinking that teachers are going to apply non-strategically, which is going to be how we identify our teacher preference model. Okay, so let's get into the model. We're going to have positions indexed by P, and each position is located at a school K. So now schools will have multiple positions. Positions will pop on and off the platform exogenously at specific points in time. And each position may have at most one teacher in the position, with the exception of the outside option, which is like the position of not teaching in this school district. On the teacher side, indexed by J, each teacher has some non-wage utility from each position, also enters and leaves the market at exogenous times, and may have at most one position. But the teacher also has a current assignment, which is last year's position. We're going to have a very simple model of why a teacher chooses to apply to a position, which is that the utility she gets from teaching in this position exceeds the utility of either of the two guaranteed options. So the two guaranteed options are I could keep my old job or I could leave the district. So I might apply to a position even if it's not among my favorites, but if I don't like my current position, I might apply to a whole bunch of other positions. Okay, we're going to parameterize the utilities to depend on a set of observables. Now, to be clear, we're not going to actually, we're going to interpret this as a prediction model. We're trying to predict how much teachers value different positions. Our object of interest really is a teacher's preference for a position and not necessarily a specific characteristic, but we're going to use the characteristics to reduce the dimensionality of this utility and make predictions. So we're going to predict utilities using commute time, the teacher's output according to our model at each school. So to be clear, they don't get compensated for this output, but maybe there's some intrinsic value to teaching where you're most effective. And we're going to have some heterogeneity around how well this predicts in terms of a mean coefficient and a random coefficient. And then we're going to also include school level or position level observables, which will be related to the composition of the students associated with each position. So these will be the fraction of students who are economically disadvantaged, Black, Hispanic, and who have above median lagged achievement. And we're going to, on these characteristics, we're going to have flexible coefficients, means, normal random coefficients. We're going to interact these coefficients with absolute advantage, and we're going to have same race matches between teacher and student type. Okay, so we get these coefficients. I'm going to show you what we get and sorry, it's a type 1 extreme value error. So we're going to have a low jet model we estimate with maximum simulated likelihood. Okay, so let me show you what this means for how much teachers are preferring schools with certain characteristics. So on the x-axis, I'm going to take a characteristic of a position. So it's commute time for this one. I'm actually not going to hold other characteristics fixed. I'm just going to compare schools at different points in the commute time distribution. And on the y-axis, I'm going to take each teacher, and according to our estimated teacher preference model, I'm going to rank this position from 0 to 100, where 100 is my favorite, it's the top one, and 0 is my least favorite. So let's focus on the middle one for now. This says that for positions that are really close to where you live, so low commute time, teachers on average have this close to the 80th percentile in their rankings. So they really like positions that are close. As the positions get further away, they like them less. So we estimate that commute time predicts quite a bit how likely you are to apply for a position. The bottom and top lines are point-wise 90th and 10th percentiles, which just shows there's a lot of heterogeneity across teachers. Some teachers are much more likely to apply to the really close positions. Some teachers are less likely. So preference heterogeneity is still on the table as potentially explaining the current equity. Okay, your own output. We actually get a coefficient that is positive, and we reject 0, and that we predict that positions where you're most effective tend to be more attractive to you. But the magnitude here is quite small. We line up the positions on the x-axis, and we see that on average, as you become more effective at a position, it doesn't really change your ranking of it. In terms of the students' characteristics, fraction of students who are economically disadvantaged does have some predictive power in terms of how much you like the position. So there's some slope from 60th percentile down to 40th percentile. Okay, so we do see that teachers would prefer to be at schools with economically advantaged students. But we can't yet say how important this is for the equilibrium assignment. Okay, on the principal side, we're going to use these ratings that they give applications to estimate preferences based on whether the principal gives the teacher a positive rating. We're going to base this off of a set of observable characteristics, the teacher's value added, experience, teacher characteristics, and so forth. When we estimate this model the same way, we now line up the teachers on the x-axis, and the y-axis is the principal's preference percentile. So at the top are the teachers the principal prefers. And we see as teachers become more effective, principals are much more likely to give them a positive rating. So principals do seem to be making decisions that are correlated with teacher quality to some extent. But again, we still don't know how important this slope is for actual assignment. In terms of just an explanatory power, while value added, while the teacher's quality does explain some of the principal's ratings, by far the most important factors that explain why principals give positive ratings are teachers' characteristics. So these are changes in pseudo R-squared from adding things to our preference model. And the ones that matter the most are teachers' experience, licensing, certification, and so forth, which is interesting because our value-added model predicts that these things don't actually predict value-added very well. So principals are still making systematic choices, just largely on things that are not so correlated with quality. Okay, so now I'm going to put these together in equilibrium and then perform some counterfactuals to kind of tell you which channel or channels we think are most explaining our results. I'm going to focus on the 2015-16 cycle. And I'm going to take our estimates from our model. For any teacher, we have actually a lot of data on any teacher because she applied or didn't to a whole bunch of positions. And so we're going to take our best guess of their random coefficients and then simulate over the type 1 extreme value errors. Okay, so I'm going to focus on equity first and then turn to efficiency. On equity, I'm going to put the advantage students value added, so the teacher quality that advantage students are receiving on the x-axis, teacher quality that disadvantaged students are receiving on the y-axis. The 45-degree line would be parity. And I'm going to model the status quo as the estimated preferences on both sides of the market, the timing, which is the periods of activity that we saw straight from the data, and then we're going to do teacher proposed deferred acceptance. When we do this, we see the status quo is slightly better for disadvantaged students, which is pretty close to what we actually just got from the current allocation. So our model fits quite well here. And based on the first slide, this is still kind of puzzling. Why is this happening when we actually do see that teachers prefer to teach advantaged students? So now we're going to change some of these components of the market. First, we're going to look at what happens if we change to school proposing. Doesn't matter. We estimate in nearly all cases a unique equilibrium. So it's not equilibrium selection. What about timing? Now we're going to open up all positions to all teachers. Assume they can coordinate the market in a way that there's no timing mismatch. Helps a little bit, but doesn't change the equity story much. Okay, now what if we change how principals act? We're going to take them from acting according to the preferences we estimated, which are largely ranking teachers based on non-value added factors, to just rank on value added, do the serial dictatorship we saw just in the prior paper. That matters a lot. So now all of a sudden we're down here. Advantage students do way better. Why? Because this is basically consistent with the prior paper. Here I'm going to take the status quo, where the principals are ranking noisily. I'm going to line up the teachers on the x-axis according to their absolute advantage. Y-axis is how much they like the position they receive in equilibrium. They actually get pretty good positions. They're towards the top, but it's pretty much a flat line. The best teachers aren't getting to choose much more than the less good teachers. But if we switch to the serial dictatorship, all of a sudden the best teachers can basically name their school. And so we let teachers' preferences actually be expressed much more directly in equilibrium. And that because the teachers' preferences are very systematic towards one student type, this generates the inequity that we might have predicted based on the initial market design. If we then change how teachers value positions, teachers rank them not according to these amenities or student composition, but according to value added solely, then we kind of more than restore the equity.
Two ways that is because teachers like to teach disadvantaged students.
They like advantaged students. So if we remove that bias and just base it solely based on their output, we kind of, let me just show you efficiency. This is like the best you can do is the black line. The best for students is the top left corner. So y-axis is value added per student. X-axis is teacher utility in commute time. So x-axis is how much teachers like things. So down here, teachers are happy. Up here, students are most happy. The status quo is very much in the interior. There are large potential efficiency gains. If we move from status quo to coordinating the market, helps a little bit, but really helps teachers, not students too much. If we then add on that principals rank according to value added, that lowers efficiency a little bit. We go down and really makes teachers even happier. So it wasn't just consequential for equity, but actually noisy principal preferences helped with efficiency, albeit this isn't a huge jump. The big gain for efficiency comes from teachers now not expressing their preferences, but acting according to their value added. And so for efficiency, the suggested policy would be something like compensating them for their output. And so in the last part of the paper that I won't be able to get into today, we think about realistic bonus schemes where we pay people for their value added and how fast you can move them from acting according to amenities to acting according to value added. Okay, so let me just conclude. We think a pretty cool combination of data. We have this test score and linkages data that we use to estimate output at each school with the model with match effects, and that has some flexibility. On the applications and vacancies, or on the teacher labor market side, we have all this micro data on applications and vacancies that we use to estimate preferences. We put them together with this matching framework. And we confirm what some other papers have found, that there's maybe a kind of a puzzle about the current allocation. Teachers have pretty systematic preferences, but this doesn't actually lead to quality differentials in the current allocation. We then use the model to convince ourselves that it's principles imperfect selection that's really leading to this equity, but it's the wage uniformity that's leading us to inefficiency. And so in the last part of the paper, which I didn't touch on, we look at the design of bonuses.
Thank you very much. Please join me.